What would you do if you were told to turn your entire army around in just 3 days, march them through snow and ice, and launch an attack in the worst winter in 60 years? Most commanders would have said it couldn't be done. But on December 19, 1944, in the French fortress town of Verdun, General George S. Patton Jr. stood before Eisenhower and the Allied High Command and claimed he could do it in less than 2. The other generals in the room thought he was joking or insane. Even the Germans would have laughed at the suggestion. Only days earlier, Hitler had unleashed a surprise offensive that tore a massive hole through Allied lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. Newspapers would call it the Bulge, a swelling in the front line where German divisions surged forward. For the Wehrmacht, this was supposed to be their miracle, the last desperate strike that could split the Allies, capture the critical port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The scale of the German gamble was staggering. Nearly 250,000 men and 1,000 tanks moved silently into position, concealed by the forests of the Ardennes and the cover of winter. They struck at dawn on December 16th, crashing into thinly held American lines and advancing with shocking speed. By the time Allied leaders gathered at Verdun, German spearheads had already penetrated 20 miles. Bastogne was surrounded, and entire U.S. divisions were scattered or destroyed. The situation seemed desperate. But Patton saw not just a crisis, but an opportunity. Where others hesitated, he prepared. Unknown to his fellow commanders, his staff had already drafted contingency plans for a rapid northward turn. When Eisenhower asked how long it would take him to counterattack, Patton's answer, 48 hours, wasn't bluster. It was a plan, already in motion. The Germans didn't know it yet, but their bold winter gamble had awakened the one Allied general who thrived in chaos. He believed that audacity itself could be a weapon, that the way to break the enemy's will was through relentless, aggressive action. And now, in the coldest winter Europe had seen in generations, he was about to prove it. George Smith Patton Jr. was born in 1885 into a proud military family in California. From childhood, he was raised to believe that his destiny was tied to war. He grew up immersed in stories of knights, conquerors, and American heroes, and he came to see himself as part of that same tradition. Unlike many of his peers who stumbled into military careers, Patton considered soldiering a sacred calling. His education reflected this single-minded devotion. At West Point, he proved to be a determined cadet, though not without flaws. His academic struggles with mathematics nearly cost him his commission. What he lacked in classroom ability, however, he more than made up for in discipline, physical courage, and an obsession with the art of war. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Caesar, Napoleon, absorbing lessons from history's greatest captains. Patton was convinced that one day he too would command men in a decisive battle.
World War I gave him his first chance. In France, he was placed in charge of America's fledgling tank corps. Patton instantly recognized the potential of armored warfare. He personally led tanks into combat, often exposing himself to enemy fire to inspire his men. It was here that he developed his lifelong belief in speed, shock, and aggressive maneuver, principles that would define his career. The war ended before Patton could prove his theories fully, but the experience left a lasting impression. The interwar years tested his patience, but sharpened his vision. He trained relentlessly, studied every innovation in mechanized warfare, and built a reputation as a brilliant, if eccentric, officer. When World War II erupted, Patton was ready. In North Africa, he restored order to the shattered U.S. Second Corps after its humiliation at Kasserine Pass. In Sicily, his lightning-fast advance outpaced both the enemy and his fellow Allied commanders. Soldiers nicknamed him Old Blood and Guts, a title he wore with pride. But his rise was nearly destroyed by his own temper. In 1943, during the Sicilian campaign, Patton slapped two soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, calling them cowards. The scandal spread quickly, almost ending his career. He was sidelined during the D-Day landings, a bitter blow for a man who believed he was destined to lead. Yet even this humiliation turned into opportunity. The Allies used Patton as the centerpiece of a grand deception, convincing the Germans that he commanded a fictitious army preparing to invade Calais. The ruse worked so well that the Wehrmacht continued to hold divisions in reserve, waiting for Patton's real landing. By the summer of 1944, Patton was back in command of the Third Army. In just 4 months, his men advanced across France at breathtaking speed, liberating thousands of towns, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and covering over 600 miles. No Allied commander moved faster or struck harder. Yet as autumn came, his momentum slowed. Stubborn German resistance in Lorraine and critical fuel shortages forced him into a grinding campaign. Critics whispered that perhaps Patton was only a pursuit general, brilliant at chasing a retreating enemy, but incapable of breaking through determined defenses. Patton himself knew otherwise. He had spent his entire life preparing for the moment when everything would depend on his ability to lead, to inspire, and to outfight the enemy. That moment arrived in December 1944, when Hitler hurled his last reserves into the Ardennes. While others saw disaster, Patton saw destiny. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes forest was shattered by the roar of artillery. Under cover of night and snow, 29 German divisions launched a massive surprise offensive against thin American lines. Hitler called it Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. But the world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. The attack achieved total surprise. Allied intelligence had failed completely. For weeks, the Wehrmacht had been shifting men and tanks under cover of darkness, using strict radio silence and deception to conceal their movements. By the time the first shells fell, nearly 250,000 German soldiers and more than 1,000 tanks were already in position.
The Ardennes seemed an unlikely place for a major offensive. It was rugged, heavily forested, and lightly defended. American units stationed there were battle-worn or inexperienced, resting after months of combat or newly arrived from the States. Hitler saw this weakness as his chance. His goal was audacious: smash through the Ardennes, cross Belgium and Luxembourg, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. If successful, it could force Britain and America to negotiate, buying Germany time, even as the Red Army closed in from the east. The German spearheads struck hard and fast. Elite SS Panzer divisions rolled forward, their Tiger and Panther tanks crushing American roadblocks. In the first hours, entire companies were overrun. The 106th Infantry Division lost 2 of its regiments in a single blow. Within days, German armored columns were racing westward, capturing villages, bridges, and crossroads. American soldiers, unprepared for the onslaught, retreated in confusion, leaving behind supplies, fuel, and artillery. By December 19, the situation was dire. German forces had advanced more than 20 miles into Belgium. The strategic town of Bastogne was surrounded, threatening to collapse the American line. Eisenhower urgently called his senior commanders to Verdun for an emergency meeting. Maps showed a massive bulge in the front lines, a swelling that threatened to split the Allied armies. Around the table, despair was evident. The First Army was shattered, divisions scattered, supply lines stretched thin. If the Germans reached Antwerp, the Allied coalition could fracture. Most commanders spoke in cautious terms, unsure of how to react. But one man was already thinking 3 moves ahead. George Patton saw not only the danger, but the opportunity. Unlike others, he was not paralyzed by the scale of the German offensive. His staff had already prepared contingency plans for just such an event. Where the enemy saw surprise, Patton saw a chance to strike back. And when Eisenhower asked the generals how long it would take to mount a counterattack, Patton stunned the room with his answer: 48 hours. The German offensive was powerful, but fragile. It depended on speed, fuel, and perfect timing. Any delay could doom it. Patton understood this instantly. He wasn't about to fight the battle on Hitler's terms. Instead, he would hit the enemy where they were weakest, the base of the Bulge. The war's outcome now hinged on whether one general could turn an army of 250,000 men, disengage them from combat, wheel them north in blizzard conditions, and strike with precision. The Germans thought it was impossible. Most of Patton's peers thought so too, but Patton had built his entire career on doing what others believed could not be done. When the emergency meeting in Verdun ended on December 19, Patton didn't waste a second. He phoned his headquarters and gave the code phrase, "Play ball." It activated the contingency plans his staff had secretly prepared. Within hours, the Third Army, 6 full divisions, 133,000 vehicles, and 62,000 tons of supplies began one of the most complex maneuvers in modern military history. The conditions were brutal. The winter of 1944-45 was the coldest Europe had seen in generations. Snowstorms reduced visibility to a few yards. Temperatures dropped below -7 degrees Celsius. Many American soldiers had only thin field jackets and wool coats. Engines froze unless restarted every half hour. And yet Patton pushed his men forward relentlessly. He visited frontline units in his open Jeep, face frostbitten but spirit unbroken. To exhausted troops, his presence was electrifying. They believed they could do the impossible because their commander demanded it, and shared their hardships. On December 22nd, German commanders surrounded Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division held out desperately. They sent an ultimatum demanding surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe answered with a single word: nuts. That defiance became legendary, but the 101st needed help. Patton was already on the move. On December 23rd, the skies cleared after weeks of storms. Allied aircraft swarmed over the battlefield, pounding German columns and dropping supplies to the trapped garrison. The next day, Patton unleashed his counterattack. 3 divisions surged north, striking the flank of the German Bulge. The 4th Armored Division led the charge, tanks and infantry smashing through enemy positions. Fighting was savage. Panthers and Tigers clashed with Shermans in frozen fields that soon became graveyards of burning steel. On December 26th, after days of desperate fighting, elements of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion broke through German lines and reached Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The narrow corridor was only 500 yards wide, but it was enough. Bastogne was saved, and with it, the chance to turn the tide. But Patton wasn't satisfied with relief alone. He saw that the German offensive had overextended itself. "This time, the Kraut stuck his head in the meat grinder," he told Bradley, "and I've got hold of the handle." For the next 6 weeks, he kept hammering, while American units from the north pressed down. The Bulge shrunk day by day. The fighting was merciless. Soldiers endured foxholes carved into frozen ground, weapons that jammed in the cold, nights spent huddling together to avoid freezing to death. The snow, once pristine, turned red with blood. By January 16, 1945, the American armies met at Falaise. The Bulge was erased. Hitler's grand offensive, meant to split the Allies and win Germany a chance at peace, ended in total failure. The Germans lost more than 100,000 men, over 700 tanks, and 1,600 aircraft, reserves they could never replace. The Wehrmacht had gambled everything and lost. The road to the Rhine, and eventually to Berlin, now lay open. Patton's role was decisive. In 72 hours, he had wheeled an entire army in the dead of winter, launched a successful counterattack, and saved Bastogne. Military historians still regard it as one of the greatest logistical and operational achievements of the war. As Patton later wrote to his wife, "Destiny sent for me in a hurry when things got tight. Perhaps God saved me for this effort."
Even Winston Churchill, never quick to praise, called the Battle of the Bulge the greatest American battle of the war. For Patton, it was more than that. It was vindication.
A lifetime of preparation culminating in the moment when his audacity, his faith in his men, and his refusal to accept the impossible turned Hitler's last gamble into catastrophe. The Ardennes would not be remembered as Hitler's triumph, but as his final defeat, and as the place where George S. Patton proved that under the harshest conditions imaginable, leadership, speed, and unyielding aggression could change the course of history.